To understand the birth of Moses, we must first look at the dark backdrop of Egypt. Centuries after Joseph had saved Egypt from famine and brought his family to settle in the fertile land of Goshen, the political landscape had radically changed. A new pharaoh ascended the throne, one who did not know Joseph. Looking out at the rapidly growing Hebrew population, this pharaoh did not see a loyal minority. He saw a national security threat. Fearful that the Israelites might ally with Egypt's enemies in a time of war, Pharaoh subjected them to brutal, crushing slave labor. Yet the biblical narrative notes a historical irony. The more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied. Desperate to curb their growth, Pharaoh took a genocidal turn. He first instructed the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, to kill all newborn boys. When these women defied his orders out of fear of God, Pharaoh issued a sweeping public decree to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. It was into this terrifying atmosphere of state-sanctioned terror that Moses was born, a birth in secret. Amidst this reign of terror, a man and a woman from the tribe of Levi, later identified as Amram and Jochebed, conceived a child. Jochebed gave birth to a son. When she looked at him, the scriptures say she saw that he was a fine child. While every mother thinks her baby is beautiful, the Hebrew word used here is tov, the very same word God used during creation in Genesis. There was an extraordinary divine light about this baby, and Jochebed knew she could not let him die. For 3 agonizing months, Jochebed managed to keep her newborn hidden. Imagine the constant terror of that household, muffling every cry, jumpy at every knock on the door, and living under the constant threat of Egyptian soldiers searching the Hebrew quarters. By the 3rd month, however, a growing baby's cries can no longer be hidden in the shadows. Jochebed realized that to keep him in the house any longer meant certain death for the entire family. She had to let him go, but she would do so in a way that surrendered him to God's providence rather than Pharaoh's cruelty. Arks had no oars, no sails, and no rudders. They were not built for navigation. They were built solely to float, completely dependent on the sovereign direction of God. Jochebed coated the basket with tar and pitch to ensure it was completely watertight, gently laid her 3-month-old son inside, and carried it down to the edge of the Nile. Rather than throwing him into the river to drown as Pharaoh had ordered, she placed the basket gently among the reeds along the bank. She chose a spot where the water was calm and where she knew people frequented. She then instructed her young daughter Miriam to stand at a distance and watch to see what would happen to him. As Miriam watched from her hiding place, the daughter of Pharaoh came down to the Nile to bathe, accompanied by her female attendants. The princess walked along the riverbank when she spotted the unusual basket nestled among the reeds. Curious, she sent one of her maids to retrieve it. When Pharaoh's daughter opened the basket, she found the baby boy. At that exact moment, the baby began to cry. This simple, vulnerable cry pierced the princess's heart. She instantly recognized the situation. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. By all accounts of Egyptian law, this child was condemned to die. As the princess, she was the daughter of the very dictator who had ordered these babies drowned. Yet compassion overcame royal duty. She chose to see a helpless child rather than a political enemy. Seeing that the princess felt pity for the baby, Miriam bravely stepped out from the shadows. Showing wisdom and composure far beyond her years, she approached Pharaoh's daughter and asked a brilliant question. "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" The princess, facing the practical challenge of how to keep a newborn alive without being able to nurse him herself, agreed. "Go." Miriam ran home as fast as she could and brought back her own mother. Imagine the overwhelming relief and joy in Jochebed's heart as she stood before the Egyptian princess. Pharaoh's daughter handed the baby back to his own mother and said, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." In a spectacular turn of divine irony, Jochebed was not only allowed to raise and protect her own son under the legal protection of the royal house, but she was also paid by the royal treasury to do so. For the first few years of his life, Moses lived safely in his own home, nurtured by his Hebrew family. During these formative years, Jochebed undoubtedly instilled in him the knowledge of his true identity, his heritage, and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Once the boy grew older and was weaned, Jochebed kept her promise. She brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who formally adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses, Hebrew, Moshe, saying, "I drew him out of the water." The linguistic double meaning. In Egyptian, mes or mesu means son of or child, as in Ramses or Thutmose. The Hebrew prophetic meaning. In Hebrew, the name actively means the one who draws out. Though the princess named him because she drew him out of the Nile, his name became a prophecy. Decades later, Moses would be the one used by God to draw the entire nation of Israel out of the waters of the Red Sea and out of the bondage of Egypt. The story of Moses' birth and his journey in the basket is more than a historical rescue mission. It is a profound testament to the power of faith and the quiet ways God works behind the scenes. Through the courage of three women, a defiant mother, a watchful sister, and a compassionate foreign princess, the champion of Israel's freedom was preserved. Moses was raised in the very palace of the Pharaoh he would eventually confront, educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, yet destined by God to set his people free. Moses grew up as a prince of Egypt, surrounded by the opulence, education, and privilege of the royal court. Yet beneath the Egyptian garments and royal signet rings, he always knew he was a Hebrew. The words of his birth mother, Jochebed, had anchored his soul to his true people. As he reached manhood, the tension between his royal status and the suffering of his biological kin became unbearable. One day, Moses left the isolated luxury of the palace to observe the reality of the Hebrew slave labors. What he saw was a brutal display of systemic oppression. Among the dust and heavy stone blocks, his eyes locked onto an Egyptian taskmaster savagely beating a Hebrew slave. Driven by an explosive mixture of righteous anger and a desire to defend the defenseless, Moses looked around to ensure no one was watching. Seeing the coast was clear, he struck the Egyptian, killing him on the spot. To hide his crime, he buried the body deep in the desert sand. Moses believed his secret was safe, and perhaps he even imagined the Hebrews would see him as a heroic deliverer. The very next day, Moses returned to the fields, expecting to find solidarity among his people. Instead, he found two Hebrew men fighting each other. Stepping in as a peacemaker, Moses confronted the aggressor, asking, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man turned on Moses with bitter resentment, spitting back words that shattered his world. "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses was struck with sudden, icy terror. Not only had his own people rejected his intervention, but his secret was completely out. The sand had not hidden his sin. Word of the murder traveled fast, eventually reaching the ears of Pharaoh. To the Egyptian throne, a royal prince killing a state official to defend a slave was not just a crime, it was high treason and the spark of potential rebellion. Pharaoh immediately issued an order for Moses' execution. Realizing his life was forfeit and his royal identity was gone, Moses fled Egypt, leaving behind everything he had ever known. Moses escaped into the harsh, sun-scorched expanse of the Sinai Peninsula, traveling east toward the land of Midian. He was no longer a prince. He was a destitute fugitive, stripped of his wealth, his status, and his home, wandering through a barren wilderness. Exhausted, dehydrated, and spiritually broken, Moses finally arrived in Midian and sat down by a community well. In the ancient Near East, wells were life-giving hubs where destinies often shifted. As he sat there, the 7 daughters of Jethro, also known as Ruel, the priest of Midian, arrived to draw water for their father's flock. They filled the troughs, but just as they finished, a group of aggressive local shepherds rode in. Following a lawless custom of the wilderness, these shepherds bullied the women, driving them away to steal the water they had just labored to draw. Even as a broken fugitive, Moses' core character remained unchanged. He could not stand by and watch injustice. He stood up, fought off the bullying shepherds, and defended the women. Going a step further, he drew water for them himself and watered their entire flock. When the daughters returned home remarkably early, their father Jethro was surprised. "Why are you back so soon today?" he asked. They answered, "An Egyptian defended us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." Jethro rebuked his daughters for their lack of hospitality. "And where is he? Why did you leave the man? Invite him to have something to eat." Moses was brought to Jethro's tent. For a man who had just lost his family and country, the warmth of Midianite hospitality was a healing balm. Moses agreed to stay with Jethro, trading his royal linen robes for the coarse wool of a simple desert shepherd. In time, Jethro gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, whom Moses named Gershom, saying, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." Moses' flight to Midian looked like a tragic detour, but it was actually a divine schoolroom. For 40 years, Moses lived a quiet, hidden life in the desert. The wilderness stripped away his Egyptian pride and reliance on human political power. As a shepherd, he learned patience, endurance, and how to navigate the very terrain through which he would one day lead millions of Israelites. The prince of Egypt had to be broken in Midian before he could become the humble servant God could use to change history. For 40 years, Moses lived the quiet, cyclical life of a Midianite shepherd. The grand palaces of Egypt, the roaring chariots, and the echoing cries of his oppressed Hebrew brethren had faded into the background of his memory. He had traded his royal scepter for a staff, his linen robes for rough wool, and his political ambition for the peace of the desert. He was an ordinary man, completely content with anonymity. One ordinary day, Moses drove his father-in-law Jethro's flock across the harsh, sun-baked wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula. He pushed deeper into the arid landscape than usual, eventually arriving at Horeb, an imposing peak known significantly in Hebrew tradition as the Mountain of God. As the sheep grazed along the rocky slopes, an unusual sight broke the monotony of the desert landscape. A common bramble bush was engulfed in flames. In the desert, brush fires were not uncommon, but as Moses watched, he noticed something impossible. Though the bush blazed intensely with a brilliant, roaring fire, its leaves did not shrivel, and its branches did not turn to ash. The fire was self-sustaining, consuming nothing. Fascinated and bewildered, Moses muttered to himself, "I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up." As Moses stepped closer to investigate, the nature of the fire changed from a visual marvel to a terrifying divine encounter. God saw that Moses had turned aside to look, and a voice thundered from the midst of the burning brambles, calling him by name. "Moses! Moses!" Startled, trembling in the sudden stillness of the mountain, Moses answered with the classic Hebrew response of absolute availability. "Hineni, here I am." Before Moses could take another step, the voice commanded, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Removing his sandals was a profound act of humility and reverence. In the ancient world, servants and slaves went barefoot. By stripping away his footwear, Moses was relinquishing his rights and standing as a servant before the King of the universe. Furthermore, the desert dirt had not changed, but the raw, unmediated presence of the Creator had consecrated the very ground beneath him. God then established his identity, anchoring this terrifying moment to historical promises. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At these words, Moses hid his face in his cloaked hands, overwhelmed by an intense, protective fear, because he was terrified to look at God. The Lord spoke of the immense suffering of the Israelites, using deeply comforting words of empathy. "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out, and I am concerned about their suffering." God declared that he had come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and bring them into a land flowing with milk and honey. Moses likely felt a surge of relief for his people, until the divine pivot occurred. God looked at the 80-year-old shepherd and declared, "So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Instantly, Moses was flooded with inadequacy. He was a wanted fugitive who had botched a rescue attempt 40 years prior. He argued, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" God did not offer Moses a speech to boost his self-esteem. Instead, he offered the only assurance that mattered: "I will be with you." Moses, anticipating that the highly theological and skeptical elders of Israel would question his mandate, raised another objection. "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God answered Moses with a breathtaking, enigmatic revelation that would echo through history. "I am who I am. This is what you have to say to the Israelites. 'I am has sent me to you.'" In Hebrew, this is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, closely linked to the sacred four-letter name of God, the Tetragrammaton, YHWH. It meant that God is entirely self-existent, eternal, unchangeable, and utterly independent of creation. The gods of Egypt had names tied to specific functions: the sun, the Nile, the harvest. But the God of Israel simply is. He is the ultimate reality, the source of all being, and the guarantor of the covenant. Armed with this eternal name, a promise of divine presence, and supernatural signs of confirmation, including a staff that transformed into a living serpent, Moses' objections were systematically answered. The burning bush transformed Moses from a forgotten, retired prince hiding out in Midian into the prophetic deliverer of Israel. The fire that did not consume the bush became a symbol of Israel itself, afflicted by the fiery furnace of Egyptian oppression, yet unconsumed because God was in their midst. Turning his back on his quiet life, Moses took his staff and set out toward Egypt to confront the greatest empire on earth. Moses returned to Egypt, no longer a fleeing fugitive, but the emboldened messenger of Yahweh. Armed with his brother Aaron as his spokesman, and a shepherd's staff that carried the authority of the Almighty, he marched into the grand audience hall of Pharaoh. The demand Moses presented was simple yet revolutionary. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: 'Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness.'" Pharaoh, who considered himself a living God on earth, sneered with absolute disdain. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." To punish their insolence, Pharaoh immediately increased the slaves' workload, forcing them to gather their own straw while maintaining the same daily quota of bricks. The battle lines were drawn. It was no longer just a struggle for human liberation. It was a cosmic showdown between the true creator and the false gods of Egypt. When Pharaoh hardened his heart, God unleashed 10 devastating plagues upon Egypt. These were not random natural disasters. Each plague was a precise, targeted judgment against a specific Egyptian deity, systematically exposing the empire's spiritual helplessness. First, the Nile, the absolute lifeblood of Egypt's economy and religion, was turned to rotting blood. Next came swarms of frogs, followed by suffocating clouds of gnats and biting flies. Disease then struck Egypt's livestock, and agonizing boils broke out on the skin of every Egyptian citizen and magician alike. As the defiance of Pharaoh continued, God sent a terrifying storm of catastrophic hail mixed with flashing fire that shattered Egypt's trees and crops. What little vegetation survived was utterly devoured by an unprecedented carpet of locusts. Then, a thick, palpable darkness blanketed the land for 3 straight days, completely blotting out the sun god. Throughout these judgments, a miraculous distinction was made. While Egypt collapsed in ruin, the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, remained completely untouched by the disasters. Yet after each plague subsided, Pharaoh stubbornly hardened his heart and refused to break the chains of Israel. The 10th and final plague was the most devastating. God announced that the firstborn son of every household in Egypt would die, from the eldest son of the slave girl to the heir of Pharaoh himself. To protect his people from the sweeping death angel, God instituted the Passover. Each Hebrew family was commanded to sacrifice an unblemished lamb, roast it, and eat it in haste, fully dressed for travel. Crucially, they were to take the lamb's blood and strike it across the tops and sides of their wooden door frames. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. At midnight, a great wail arose across Egypt. Death entered every unprotected house, including the royal palace. Pharaoh's own son lay dead. Broken, grieving, and utterly defeated, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron in the dark of night and screamed, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested." The departure was an explosion of triumphant freedom. After 430 years of bondage, more than 2 million Israelites marched out of Egypt in broad daylight. They did not leave as hanging-headed refugees. The Egyptians, terrified of further wrath, practically begged them to go, showering them with gold, silver, and fine clothing. Israel plundered their oppressors without lifting a weapon. Guided by a majestic pillar of cloud by day and a roaring pillar of fire by night, Moses led the vast multitude toward the wilderness. However, looking at his devastated empire, Pharaoh rapidly changed his mind. He assembled his elite military corps, 600 of his finest iron chariots, and pursued the fleeing slaves, cornering them against the unyielding waters of the Red Sea. Trapped between an advancing army and a deep sea, the Israelites panicked, crying out to Moses in terror. Moses stood firm, his voice echoing across the shore. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again." God commanded Moses to raise his staff over the water. A powerful, supernatural east wind tore through the sea all night, miraculously driving the waters back and creating a dry highway walled by towering blocks of water on their right and left. Israel marched straight through the belly of the sea, safely to the other side. When the Egyptian chariots blindly charged into the seabed in pursuit, the wheels bogged down in the mud. As soon as the last Israelite stepped onto safe shores, God commanded Moses to stretch his hand out once more. The massive walls of water collapsed with catastrophic force, swallowing Pharaoh's entire army. Standing safely on the opposite shore, watching the great power of God, the Israelites finally believed. Led by Moses and Miriam, they sang a glorious song of victory, celebrating the moment they were truly born as a free nation under God. The Red Sea was behind them, and the chains of Egyptian bondage were broken. But the nation of Israel was not yet truly formed. They were a vast, chaotic multitude of former slaves, wandering through a harsh desert. Guided by the pillars of cloud and fire, Moses led them deep into the Sinai Peninsula until they camped at the base of Mount Sinai, the very place where God had first spoken to Moses from the burning bush. 3 months after leaving Egypt, the landscape transformed from a quiet desert into an arena of terrifying divine majesty. God descended upon the peak of Mount Sinai in a dense, roiling cloud of smoke and fire. The entire mountain trembled violently, and the air split with a blast of a supernatural trumpet that grew louder and louder. Leaving the trembling Israelites at the foot of the mountain, Moses climbed up into the thick darkness to meet the Almighty. There, amid the thunder and lightning, God gave Moses the foundation of civil, moral, and spiritual law for the new nation. The Ten Commandments, carved by the finger of God onto two heavy tablets of stone. Moses remained on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, receiving detailed instructions for the tabernacle, a portable tent that would house God's holy presence among them. Down below, however, time moved too slowly for the panicking Israelites. Seeing that Moses was gone so long, they gathered around Aaron and demanded, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." In a tragic failure of leadership, Aaron melted down their gold earrings and fashioned a golden calf. The people began to worship it, indulging in wild pagan revelry, declaring the idol to be the god that delivered them from Egypt. When Moses descended the mountain carrying the two stone tablets, he heard the roaring shouting. Rounding the corner of the peak, he saw the golden calf and the dancing crowd. Flashing with a righteous fury, Moses smashed the stone tablets at the foot of the mountain, physically demonstrating how Israel had broken their sacred covenant with God. He ground the golden calf into powder, scattered it in the water, and made the people drink it. Stepping into the breach to save his people from total destruction, Moses returned to the mountain to plead for God's mercy. God relented, and Moses carved two new stone tablets to replace the broken ones. When he finally returned to the camp, his face radiated an intense, blinding light because he had spoken directly with the Lord. With the tabernacle constructed and the laws established, Israel finally marched toward the promised land of Canaan. When they reached the border, Moses sent 12 spies to scout out the territory. After 40 days, the spies returned. While they agreed the land was incredibly fertile, 10 of the spies brought back a terrifying report. The cities were heavily fortified, and the inhabitants were giants. Only Caleb and Joshua urged the people to trust God and conquer the land. The camp broke into frantic weeping, muttering mutiny and wishing they had died in Egypt. Heartbroken by their total lack of faith, God declared a severe judgment. "Not one of you who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, not one of you will ever see the land I promised on oath to your ancestors." For every day the spies scouted the land, Israel would wander a year in the wilderness. The nation was condemned to roam the desert for 40 years until that entire faithless adult generation died out. The wilderness years became a grueling crucible of training. Moses patiently steered the grumbling nation through decades of heat, tribal warfare, and scarce resources. Yet even Moses, under the heavy pressure of leadership, faltered. When the people cried out for water at Meribah, an angry Moses struck a rock twice with his staff in frustration, rather than speaking to it as God had commanded, failing to show God's holiness. Because of this disobedience, God told Moses he would see the promised land from a distance, but would not lead the people into it. At the end of the 40 years, a new, battle-tested generation stood on the banks of the Jordan River. Moses, now 120 years old but still possessed of clear vision and natural strength, delivered his final, powerful speeches to Israel, urging them to remain fiercely loyal to God. Moses climbed to the lonely peak of Mount Nebo. There, God showed him a breathtaking panoramic view of the Promised Land. On that mountain, Moses, the servant of the Lord, died. God buried him in an undisclosed valley, closing the chapter on the greatest prophet Israel had ever known, and passing the torch of leadership to Joshua.